Welcome to this webinar. My name is Bluth, and I'm in the Global Economic Dynamics team of Bertelsmann Stiftung. In this team, I work in particular on the subject of WTO reform, which is also the subject today. I'm delighted to welcome Ignacio Garcia-Becerro, Chad.Bown, and Fabry. Ignacio has used his fellowship to develop some thoughts on the future of the WTO and how it can be reformed. And we are delighted that we have the opportunity to publish his thoughts and also to discuss them today. Ignacio, you might know that he also has another job besides this one, but he'll be speaking today in his capacity as EU visiting fellow at the European Studies Centre of St. Anthony's College of the University of Oxford. Chad.Bown is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Elvire Fabry, a senior research fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. Today would be the day just after MC12 had COVID-19 not happened and the conference taken place as scheduled. Maybe on that day we would have still had a webinar and reflected on how the conference actually went and what we take away from it for the future of the world trading system. But MC12, we still have to wait for a little longer, and what has happened in the meantime hasn't actually made the situation any easier. It wasn't easy to start with. The Appellate Body is in crisis. We need to find ways to flexibilize the WTO, and whether the plurilateral initiatives are going to be the most effective way forward, we don't know yet. We have to tackle the increasingly contentious issue of industrial subsidies, and we have to think about how to actually bring sustainability in the foreground of the trade policy discussions. So there was already a lot of stuff to cover, but then COVID-19 hit the world economy, and it has undermined trust in the world trading system because of many export bans. And the state aid that is going to be rolled out in the meantime is not going to make the subsidies issues any easier. So, and what also happened in the meantime, of course, is that DG Azevedo announced his resignation. And that is actually a step that might reignite the debate on WTO reform, because I imagine that when now the candidates come forward, they'll articulate their vision for the future of the organization. So I think, and I hope that the next months will actually see an increased debate about where the member states want to take this organization. So I'm very much looking forward to hear Ignacio's thought. Before we start with this, I have just a few housekeeping points for this event. First of all, we're going to kick this off with Ignacio's remarks. And then we are going to hear from Chad.Bown and Elvire Fabry, who act as discussants today. After that, the three panelists will have a bit of a chat amongst themselves, and then we'll open it up to a general Q&A. You're welcome to ask questions, but also to comment on what you have seen. I'll post links in the chat function to Ignacio's paper, to the other work that we in the Global Economic Dynamics team have done on WTO reform. And I should also mention that this event is on the record. So if you are not happy with appearing in the recording, then your only choice is to remain silent or to ask questions through the chat function. That actually should be the way. If you want to ask a question or make a statement, please post a message in the chat, and then I'll give you the floor when the time comes. So that was all from me. And with that, I hand it over to Ignacio. Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. And it's a great pleasure to be having this webinar. I have been very lucky to be able to cooperate with the Bertelsmann institution on this project. What I would like to do as a presentation is not so much to summarize what the paper is saying. The paper has two parts. The first part is analytical and tries to understand what is the reason for the current crisis of the WTO and why the WTO, from my point of view, continues to be fully relevant. And the second part is a set of proposals on WTO reform. But what I would like to do is to start by putting all of this in the context which is provided by the need to move towards a cooperative approach to the economic recovery from COVID-19. At some point in time, hopefully sooner rather than later, there would be a need to manage to move towards the phase of planning how to recover from the pandemic, and that is going to imply a number of challenges for trade policy. I would summarize those challenges as being essentially 6. First, it would be important to maintain the international cooperation on trade in medical products, to avoid new export restrictions, to try to ensure there is cooperation so that scarce medicines and vaccines can reach those that are most in need. And trade policy would need to play a role on that. Beyond the particular sector of medical products, it is probably an understatement to say that the last 3 years have been 3 years of high turbulence in the trading system, of escalating trade disputes, trade wars. I think it will be very problematic for the recovery from the pandemic if we don't find a way of changing the dynamic and to moving towards a more cooperative approach on trade policy, a de-escalation of trade conflicts, and further liberalization. So that is challenge number 2. Third key issue is subsidies. It is very clear that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that in many places, there is going to be more active industrial policies. Subsidies of different types are going to become increasingly used. And without proper rules to manage those issues, the potential for increased trade conflicts is clearly going to increase. Fourthly, there is the situation of vulnerable developing countries, which are going to be particularly negatively affected as a result of the economic depression, and that would also need to be factored in. And last but not least, 2 issues where you need to fix the rule book. At this point in time, there are no international rules on the digital economy. And if there's something also which the pandemic has shown is the importance of digital for the modern economy. And we are still living this crisis of WTO dispute settlement. So if you actually look into these 6 challenges, my first point would be to say all of these are essentially global challenges. Are issues for which free trade agreements have become the default option for trade policy would not provide a response or could just simply lead to a fragmentation of rules. So if you actually want to respond in a cooperative manner to those challenges, you would need to look into the role of multilateral institutions. And of course, that means fundamentally, you would need to look into the WTO. The problem is that, of course, the WTO is currently affected by a deep crisis. In my paper, I go in more detail about what are the reasons for this crisis. To summarize, I would say a combination of 3 factors. First, some institutional weaknesses in the design of the WTO. The WTO has a very rigid negotiating function, which has not really been able to deliver much since its creation. It has a very limited policy initiative role for the Director General, and that means that some of the potential of the organization has not perhaps been fulfilled. And on the other hand, it has a very strong, or it used to have, a very strong and autonomous dispute settlement system. And if you put the 3 elements together, you see that sooner or later we would be facing a crisis like the one that we are facing now. The second one is more substantive. From the very early days, it has been clear that there are substantive divergences in terms of what WTO members expect from the organization, in which direction they want the organization to move. I would probably bring this back to the famous Seattle Ministerial Conference. And if you want to encapsulate what these divergences are about, I think fundamentally it's divergences about how far the organization should be tackling sustainable development issues. And by that, I mean the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the environmental, and the social dimension. And last but not least, and this is the factor which I discuss in more detail in my paper, there is the impact on the organization of the conflict between the United States and China. The emergence of China as the largest trading nation inevitably implies the need to adjust the rules of the game. It also implies the need to have a new balance of market access commitments. But unfortunately, the choice of the United States and of China has been to manage this conflict outside the framework of any many multilateral rules. So you want the WTO to play the role that it should play to tackle those global challenges, inevitably you would need to reform the WTO. It is only through reform that the WTO would be able to meet the challenges which I mentioned in the beginning. Now, the second part of my paper includes a number of proposals on WTO reform. They are summarized in an annex, so those who don't want to read a very long paper, they can go straight into the annex. But basically, I would say that these proposals fall under three headings. The first heading is what I would call improving the institutional balance of the WTO. You need to have a stronger negotiating and deliberating function. Now, in order to reinforce and to give again credibility to the negotiating function, the main idea which is included in my paper is a new architecture for open plurilateral agreements, and I'm happy to discuss that in more detail, but it is one of the key elements that I think is key to revitalize the negotiating function of the WTO. In order to see how the WTO can be a stronger forum for monitoring and deliberation on trade policies, I have a number of proposals, including accepting that the Director General needs to have a certain greater role of policy initiative, but there are other ideas in the paper. And of course, last but not least, there is dispute settlement. I think binding two-step dispute settlement is absolutely critical. You cannot imagine the WTO without the binding two-step dispute settlement, but you need to be able to accept that there have to be important adjustments in the dispute settlement function. Again, this is something which I discuss in more detail in my paper, but to summarize, you need to have a more focused appellate function, something which is probably closer to what WTO negotiators initially had envisaged the Appellate Body would do when they concluded the WTO agreement in 1995. You need to look into how to accelerate and strengthen the panel phase of dispute settlement procedures. And I think that you also need to take responsibility and negotiate the clarification of some of the rules on trade remedies, which have been at the heart of the dissatisfaction about the way that the Appellate Body has been functioning in a number of areas. So those three elements, in my view, would need to be part of a negotiation that finds a fix to the dispute settlement function. The second set of proposals relates to what I would call anchoring the WTO negotiating and deliberating function on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. This will have, in my view, first of all, a political function, giving a certain sense of purpose for the trading system, as a unifying element for the WTO membership. It would need to start through demonstrating that the WTO can deliver, and that's what I give a lot of importance to three specific areas. One is, of course, concluding the negotiations on fisheries subsidies. The second one is relaunching the negotiations on the elimination of tariffs on climate-related products, something that was quite close to conclusion, but then it was put on the freeze. And thirdly, there is an initiative on trade and health that would look into three elements: tariff elimination, disciplines on export restrictions, and also seeing how the monitoring role of WTO in cooperation with WHO and others can better function to ensure that there is a proper distribution of scarce medical supplies. Those are the more urgent steps, but I believe that this is just a beginning, and the WTO needs to open a reflection about how the organization is better equipped to contribute towards the three core dimensions of sustainability: integration of developing countries, vulnerable developing countries in the trading system, environmental sustainability, and the contribution of trade to decent work. So that, if you want, is the second block. And the third one is how to ensure that the rules of the WTO and the market access commitments are sufficiently adapted to better address the interface between industrial policies and to respond to 21st century realities. You have mentioned one issue which is probably the most difficult, but also the most critical one, which is disciplines on subsidies. I will not say much on that now, because I think that both Herbie and Chad would want to say more on the issue of subsidy, but certainly that's going to be a bit la pièce de résistance, the more challenging, but probably also the more critical issue under this particular heading. I also present an idea in my paper about the possibility of negotiating an open plurilateral agreement on competitive neutrality, by which I mean issues such as forced technology transfer, certain aspects of intellectual property, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, regulatory transparency, all of which are issues to ensure that once a company is established in a market, is not subject to negative favoritism vis-a-vis its competitors. And this is something which, again, I think it would be an important element in order to reinforce the disciplines of the WTO on the interface of industrial policies. There are, of course, also other elements. I do not say much in my paper, but of course, we already are having important discussions in the WTO on e-commerce and on investment facilitation. And these, again, are two very good examples of open plurilateral initiative that should be embedded in the WTO. And finally, there is market access. On market access, I suggest a step-by-step approach to begin first to see where on these sectorial initiatives, climate products and medical products, it is possible to reach an agreement which is as broad as possible in terms of participation. I think this would have an important demonstration effect. It would also be, quite frankly, a way for China to demonstrate that it is ready to take commitments that correspond to the fact that they are the largest trading partner. Clearly, China should not ask for SDT in any such negotiations and should be ready to open up as much as the United States and the European Union and others. It would also be an important demonstration that the United States is ready to liberalize trade multilaterally. So I think they have an important demonstration effect. But if we manage to get that, then I think we should begin to explore where beyond this, it is possible to look into further initiatives to liberalize trade, both on tariffs, but also on services. I think we should not forget, after all, that one of the weaknesses of the current WTO framework is that services commitments have not been updated since the Uruguay round. And there's a huge gap between those commitments and the current realities of international trade. So it is quite an ambitious agenda, if you want. I would argue it's also a realistic agenda. Of course, not everything is going to be done in one day. And if you look into the perspective of MC12, I think what you could expect is that at that point in time, hopefully you can already show some immediate results, for instance, on fishery subsidies, on the trade and health initiative. And you can open up a process to complete this agenda on WTO reform over a certain period of time. Of course, it would only be possible if this is identified as a high priority. It's something that should really attract top political attention. In my view, we are looking into the recovery from the pandemic. There are going to be three critical international challenges in terms of cooperation. There's going to be implementation of the Paris Agreement. I would imagine that it would be the top priority, at least from the point of view of the European Union. There's going to be how to cooperate to tackle what is going to be likely to be a very difficult economic situation in some vulnerable developing countries. And there's going to be trade, how to avoid that we continue to have a dynamic of escalation of trade conflicts, how we can restore confidence on the positive role of trade in the world economy. And for this, the key element is going to be how we can develop this WTO agenda. So where this could happen or not, I think is an open question. It is political. It depends about political developments on the key players. The only thing which I can say is that if it doesn't happen, and if we have to face a deep depression with an escalation of trade conflicts, I think that's a scenario that we have not really seen since the 1930s, and it did not particularly end well at that point in time. So I think I would leave it there, and looking forward to the comments by Herbie and by Chad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. And Chad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, Christian, and for the opportunity to be here. First, I should say that I'm doing this recording or this from a new room, and I'm looking at the video, and I seem to be very orange. I just want to assure everybody that I'm okay. It's the lighting. I'm not sort of morphed into a Donald Trump-like color or anything like that. So first, let me say, if you haven't yet, you should definitely read Ignacio's piece. It's amazing. It's coherent. It's comprehensive. It's well articulated. It's all there. It's essentially a book that provides a comprehensive discussion, thoughtful analysis of most all of the major issues that confront the multilateral trading system today. So for everything is there. And congratulations, Ignacio. It's just I know what it's like to put something like that together, and you deserve the congratulations for that. But at the same time, politically, it's not going to be feasible to do all of those things. You referred to it as an ambitious agenda. I think of this as now we really need to start prioritizing, or we run the real risk of the multilateral system dissolving in terms of importance, and fragmenting and becoming less and less relevant. And obviously I speak of this, as an American. My remarks, I'll apologize in advance, will be very American centric and American focused. But that's mainly to, I think, reiterate and highlight just how important it is for the WTO to make progress on some key issues for it to remain relevant for the United States. Now, some of this is political. If the Trump administration is reelected, that may be irrelevant. There may be nothing the WTO can do to sort of stay relevant for the interests of a second term in the Trump administration. But if it's a Biden administration, there's a role for the WTO to play. But if we think back to the Obama administration, there were a lot of things that they wanted to do that just weren't happening. So I think we need to get to the stage of prioritizing some of your laundry lists, Ignacio. And so my first question to you would be, what are your priorities? Of all of those things, what would you put first and foremost? And there's basically three topics that I want to get at, but that was the first one, a question to Ignacio. The second main topic I want to have us talk a little bit about is how all of this has become more complicated by the pandemic. And so, if you read Ignacio's piece, much of it, could have been written before January, and I'm virtually, in alignment with most everything that's there. So there's nothing that's wrong, but life is just now a lot more complicated in a number of different ways, as Ignacio has spelled out. And so there's a lot of that in there. I want us to think about a couple of those. One on sort of the export restrictions. If we think about PPE and medical equipment, those types of issues, I think they're clearly important today. I'm not sure how important they are as a long-term structural issue for the WTO. We need to think through this a little bit, or at least not the same way, right? And so let me be precise. We've gotten to the stage, I think, with PPE especially, that so many countries now around the world are incentivizing production, local production, that we may, within a matter of months, go from a world in which we have massive shortages, which led to, the export restrictions, which were very damaging politically, and also not useful for the free, the flow of goods, to a situation where we now have an excess of a lot of this stuff, it going all around the world, and there, one could imagine countervailing, duty cases about these things, because there's now sort of excess global supply of some of these things. So the trade problems could very well shift in some of these areas. I agree, some other areas are going to be critical as well. What are we going to do about vaccines and hoarding when we get to that stage, or treatments, other issues? It's not to say that there aren't issues for us to think about and worry about. The regulatory impediments that came up during the crisis, I think, are kind of important for us to think about long term. But I think the initial concerns that we had at the very beginning phase of the crisis, with the export restrictions on PPE, for example, back in March, I'm not sure I want to put them on the long-term agenda in terms of the sustainability of the trading system. That being said, the economic crisis that I think we now find ourselves in is, as IGNACIO said, one of the key elements in challenges facing the trading system, I think, for the foreseeable future. And so I think Christian put in the chat box there, I wrote a piece about this for Foreign Affairs about a month or so ago, laying out what I think are some of the key concerns. One is, we have seen governments responsibly use fiscal policy to help manage the crisis. Massive subsidies, throwing tremendous amounts of money at firms to keep them going, to keep people employed, to keep economies going, right? That's very different from industrial policy of targeting specific firms for strategic advantage, or reshoring supply chains, ensuring adequate supplies of key medical equipment, right? And but that being said, there are tremendous amount of subsidies now out there in the system that we've never had to think about before. What happens when we have an asynchronous opening up of markets, as we've already started to see, right? China is now more open, got there first than everybody else, starts exporting again. You see surges of imports coming into your market. A lot of your firms are still closed or injured. So you see an onrush, an onslaught of trade defense instrument cases. What are we going to do about these? Right? They're going to be coming. Some of them are legitimate, but some of them, everybody's gotten subsidies. How are we going to triage this? We haven't seen anything like this before. How are we as the trading system prepared to handle this? We didn't want to stop governments from subsidizing to get us through the initial hardship of the economic problem of the pandemic. But we sort of do want to do something to discipline countries so they don't end up massively engaging in trade restrictions, countervailing measures, anti-subsidy measures. But we're seeing no global cooperation on these types of issues. And this is a very different moment than 2008, where we saw the G20 play a very, very large role that prevented the onslaught of protectionism from erupting. We're not seeing anything like that today. And I think that's a big concern for me. My third and final point, and this is the big kind of structural question on subsidies, we kind of had a process for how to think about the issue of industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. Wasn't really grabbed onto by the Americans, the Trump administration, but the Commission, the Japanese, they finally did convince the trilateral process to put out some text in January before the phase 1 agreement was released with China, the US-China agreement, and before the pandemic hit, about what a potential, say an open plurilateral on industrial subsidies might look like. The idea being politically that it might be time to begin socializing the rest of the WTO membership about what these rules might be, and then beginning to engage with China on something like this. Is that still a feasible approach given the new world in which we live, where now everybody is worried about reshoring supply chains for public health reasons? Obviously, the ongoing conflict between the United States and China, despite the phase 1 agreement, has not stopped. We're now seeing in Europe, but also in the United States as well, new calls for industrial policy. This week, we've got legislation to potentially subsidize the semiconductor industry. We've seen massive new proposed export controls for semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Industrial policy from the American side, the USTR has sort of openly embraced this. That's very different from what the United States seemed to be asking of China as late as 6 months ago. So it's just politically, are we in a very different world right now where how we might think about an open plurilateral in the text that was being written on industrial subsidies, is that still relevant for today? If not, does it need to be modified? You're going to have your work cut out for you, Ignacio, when you get back to Brussels. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Chad. Well, there are plenty of points already, but before I give you, Ignacio, the chance to respond to it, I think we first hear from Elvia Fabry. I'm looking forward to your comments. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Christian, for the invitation to join this discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here, and when I see so many good experts joining the webinar, I think it will be very interesting to have everybody stepping in the discussion, because I think there would be many interesting comments for Ignacio on his report. And thank you, Ignacio, for taking 1 year out from the Commission to put that all together in this incredible report. I joined Chad in the comments that I think it's going to be the reference for many years to manage this most needed reform of the WTO. It comes very timely. It's very extensive. You only had a glimpse at what's inside when you were listening to Ignacio just previously. I think it's particularly interesting because it goes back to the purpose, the existential purpose of WTO. Why? Where are we coming from? Where do we stand? Which is also important to underline, because it's all about the legacy of WTO, of what we have to preserve today. The current problems, the inertia, internal inertia, the external challenges, of course, challenges ahead. The sequencing is particularly interesting with the short-term priorities and the mid-term priorities until 25. Hopefully, it will be until 25. And all that fits in some efficient scenarios, as you have described them that much, Ignacio, but the way you have presented your 3 scenarios between confrontation, focusing on the major factor of the evolution of the relations between the US and China, the 3 scenarios that you have put forward, with the confrontation on one side, of course, the decoupling scenario, which would lead to 2 main coalitions. And the question would be for Europe, is there
I'm afraid it appears we have lost Elvia, which is, there she is. Sorry, I think, Elvia, you were, I think there was a connection problem, but we are glad to have you back, so please continue.
me? Can you hear me well? It's okay? Okay. And the second scenario has to see with the competition, while with the confrontation of the big 2 powers, but would be channeled through a bilateral mode. And the third, more positive, optimist scenario would, of course, has to see with the cooperation and possibility for common rules. Of course, now we are currently in a sort of apnea mode until November, waiting to see what would be the outcomes of the elections. But we have to be prepared for the 2 first scenarios, which would be the confrontation and the competition scenarios. And the focus is how to foster the resilience of the global rules in between. Obviously, there's no possibility for global trade if there's no common rule. And everybody would have too much to lose to go back to the far west of trade. So there's a priority for global trade to preserve at least the current existing rules. And the new question today is how W can contribute to the recovery as a priority. Of course, we have to keep in mind that from a US point of view, if China recovers quicker than the US, it will be a big failure for the American First strategy, trying to limit the Chinese tech leadership. And so the contribution of a WTO in the short term will be obviously essential. And I want to go back to one element that IGNACIO was mentioning, which was the capacity to preserve some confidence in the global system and to rebuild that confidence. And it takes me back to one element that Chad just had focused on, which is the role of subsidies. If we go back to that idea of what should we prioritize, if we have to prioritize something to avoid further fragmentation and what could be a very quick fragmentation if not in the coming months, in the coming years, and to avoid that dismantlement of rules, but to also avoid an amplification of the asymmetric shock of the recession, we have to address that issue concerning subsidies. I have a feeling that I'm repeating what Chad is saying, but I think it's a central key issue, which is the huge distortive effect that those massive, legitimate stimulus package, but massive package, will have on the global scene. IGNACIO, in your paper, you mentioned in some deep pockets, and obviously the size of the pockets are quite different from one country to another one. Can you hear me well? I see that you. And I think my question has to see with what can we do about that issue about subsidies to pave the way for further regulation. Chad was raising the question about the future of the trilateral agreement, and obviously at the moment we don't know if it's an issue that we have even to raise. If it's not better to wait at least the beginning of 2021. But the further question would be, what can we do to pave the way for that future regulation? And if it's not, if the WTO hasn't an urgent need for to call for an effort about notification of subsidies, to have the capacity to monitor what is happening, beyond all the measures that have been taken to address the pandemic, all the new subsidies that are implemented to address the recovery issue. We know that the Secretary General has put in place a system to gather together all those measures addressing the pandemic. Shouldn't we extend at least that system to current subsidies? Of course, it remains a quite ambitious objective currently, but to preserve transparency, the maximum transparency which is one of the key problems in the capacity that we have to address subsidies and to trace subsidies. I think that without being too Eurocentric at this point, there's some quite interesting elements in the way competition policy at the European level has been addressing the first step of the pandemic and the recovery now. The EU has been quite effective in opening the possibility to make some exemptions on subsidies, on state aid, but at the same time, those exemptions, they were really drafted in a way that it was completely framed with some strict conditions, with some very specific differentiation between subsidies that were allowed and others that wouldn't be allowed. The idea was to avoid a sort of a free festival of subsidies within the single market, and already paving the way for the phasing out of those subsidies. And that might be the interesting element also at the at the multilateral level, would be to see how to pave the way for that phasing out, and at least for a comeback of the ambition of the trilateral agreement. And with that, I will finish now, just to continue with the discussion.
Thank you very much. We've had lots of interesting thoughts, a European and American perspective. Ignacio, I think you're probably itching now to get back and say what you think about these comments, please. Ignacio, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now,
yes.
Now we should be able to hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So let me just focus at this point in time on 3 questions raised by Chad and by Erbeer, or having seen questions also being put by quite a few friends in the audience, but I suppose we could come back to those later on. So what I would like to tackle is this question about priorities, the issue about what to do about subsidies in the new world, which is emerging from COVID-19, and then the question about how all of this relates to the US-China conflict. Now, if I had to choose 5 topics within what Chad has called my laundry list, which I think really need to be done, I'm very much insisting this is a sequencing issue. It is not all things being done in the beginning. It's something to be developed over a 4-year time frame, starting from MC12. But if there are 5 things which I think that the WTO at least needs to be able to deliver, is fisheries subsidies. It is not able to deliver an agreement on fisheries subsidies, any credibility that the WTO may want to have to show that it is relevant for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm afraid that that is going to disappear. So that has to be delivered, and hopefully by MC12. I think delivering a liberalization initiative on climate would be politically quite important. I mean, the implementation of the Paris Agreement is going to be the critical priority for the international community over the years ahead. There's going to be very complicated discussions on a number of issues. And again, I think it will be critical that the WTO shows that it can deliver. And quite frankly, it should not be so difficult. We were quite advanced on negotiations on environmental rules, even if it was on a critical mass basis. It should not be so difficult to deliver on that. Third, subsidies, and I will come back later on why subsidies continue to be one of the must-have. Then e-commerce, again, that's something where there's a huge dynamic behind those bilateral negotiations on Geneva, and again, it will be critical in being able to show that the WTO is relevant for the 21st century. So that would be another must-have from my point of view. And last but not least, dispute settlement. You cannot imagine the WTO without a functioning, binding dispute settlement. I mean, the interim solution which has been developed by the European Union and others is good for the time being, but we need to be able to bring back the United States on board on binding the dispute settlement. So at least those 5 issues, in my view, need to be delivered. That doesn't mean that it needs to be done all in one go. Some of these issues like subsidies are quite complicated. It's going to take some time before we can craft improved rules on subsidies. But I think if the WTO does not deliver on those 5 issues, we would have a problem in terms of showing the WTO relevance. Now, on subsidies, let me say that paradoxically, I personally think that the situation that we have now after COVID-19, after the announcements that the European Union in certain areas is going to be looking into subsidies on strategic sectors. The United States has just announced the possibility of subsidies in the semiconductor sector, shows that this is an issue which is much broader than the China issue. And that, in my view, paradoxically, could potentially pave the way for a more balanced, a more negotiation on subsidies. Now, this is not to say that it should be a different approach to the one that was developed in the trilateral. The trilateral just focused, from my point of view, on one aspect, which is those areas where disciplines should be strengthened, and that was what the focus of the trilateral is. But I am convinced that if you want to negotiate on subsidies, you need to follow a more balanced approach. You need to go back to what was the approach of the Uruguay-bound subsidies agreement, with 3 types of subsidies: prohibited subsidies, amber subsidies, for which there is a presumption of serious prejudice, and critically a green list of subsidies, which basically, provided that certain conditions are met, should be generally acceptable. And in my view, what we would need to start to develop is an approach which looks into the three elements, which is not just targeted on the practice of a particular country, because everyone is going to be subsidizing to a certain extent. The question is, can you do this on the basis of certain common disciplines to avoid that we actually have a free-for-all and a continuous escalation of conflicts in relation to subsidies. I agree with her view that transparency is a key element, and maybe one can even start from transparency. For instance, I mean, I'm just talking off the top of my head, benefiting from my academic freedom. Why don't countries agree, at least, that all new subsidies programs which are being developed in the context of the recovery from COVID-19 should be notified to the WTO, so that there is a better basis to understand what's going on. So I think it cannot just be transparency, but I agree that perhaps transparency is at least a first step where it will be important to make progress. Finally, on to China. I mean, it's very clear that if the approach is going to be confrontation, a new Cold War, then I don't think that anything of what we are discussing is really going to work. One would need to see what one can do with the WTO in those circumstances, and one should think about resilience. But if the strategy is going to be one of all-out confrontation, all-out decoupling, then we are certainly not going to be able to focus the international community on the cooperative approach to deal with COVID-19. At the same time, we should not be naive. Relationship with China cannot just simply be based on cooperation. There's going to be a very important element of competition, competition about economic models, competitions relating to technologies. Certain areas of policy is not realistic to expect that it will be tackled in the WTO. I don't expect that we will have discussions in the WTO on investment screening. I don't expect that we will have discussions in the WTO about export controls relating to critical technologies. All of those are areas of policy which would not be part of the WTO exercise. But it's very difficult to imagine a revitalized WTO that does not imply cooperation with China to try to identify an agenda, at least on this issue of the interface of industrial policy. So that's the perspective which I think one should try to situate itself. It, of course, also implies a certain choice by the United States that instead of choosing confrontation, they decide that they want to challenge China on certain issues, but they don't want to do it on their own. They want to do it more collectively, and they want to do it within a rule-based framework rather than on the basis of bilateral bargaining. So it would imply a certain change of the approach of the U.S. administration about how to deal with China. So this is very political. We would need to see to what extent this is an approach that is chosen by the United States and by China, because of course I'm sure that also some in China who see that maybe the best way for China is to decouple, and that in any case that's what they should do. So I think this is certainly going to be a politically important issue in the year ahead. I suspect that in Europe we will probably want to be on a strategy which combines competition and in some cases very tough competition with cooperation.
Thank you very much. If Elvira or Chad, you want to get back at this point, I would like to give you that opportunity. Otherwise, I'm also happy to open it up to the floor. We have a number of questions already, and I would like to give our audience also the opportunity to participate. But I think Elvira at least looks like she wants to say something, and Chad as well. So shall we this time hear from Elvira first and then Chad?
Well, just a brief reaction, going back again to subsidies, because I agree that the issue about the distinction between the different kind of subsidies is a key one, and maybe a quite sensitive issue to put again on the table at the moment, precisely when we want to find the right balance, even in Europe, on between more strategic autonomy with an industrial policy, and as well in the US, the issue is the same. But I think there's another very interesting element in the trilateral agreement on industrial subsidies, which was the reverse of the burden of the proof. And I wonder whether, of course, I mean, it would have a huge impact on preserving more transparency on the subsidies that are applied. And I wonder whether it wouldn't also provide some ground for a potential plurilateral cooperation of like-minded countries in a way that it could provide some leverage on China to prepare it for further reduction of subsidies. At the moment, the idea is not to dismantle the trilateral agreements. Let's keep it alive if it's not frozen. But at least the idea of the reverse of the burden of the proof could be used and developed more extensively between like-minded countries.
Over to you, Chad.
Ignacio, I wanted to push you on the one other thing though. So thank you for answering those questions, very coherent, and I don't disagree with what you said. But the one that I still don't know how we're gonna deal with is the onslaught of TDI cases that we're gonna see over the next year and a half, because we're all non-market economies now in terms of how much subsidies have been given out, how much are going to be continued to give out, and how everybody is going to be able to show easily that they're injured, right? Our trade defense laws are set up to accommodate mass amounts of protection in this kind of environment. So what do we do about that? Does that concern you? And is there anything that we can do in the short term? And this is kind of separate from the long-term systemic WTO issues. But I fear if we don't address and think ahead about what to do about this over the next 18 months, this erupts into a new problem that could derail us from having to also deal with a lot of the other long-term systemic issues. I don't have a good answer to that, but you've been thinking hard about a lot of things, so I'm hoping you do.
Well, I think that the questions that you have raised are quite tough, but I would try just to venture to some elements of response. Now, Elvira, I agree that the reversal of burden of proof is one of the key concepts in the trilateral paper. I would not call it agreement, I would call it paper, because I think the key is to move beyond the trilateral and to get on board not only like-minded, but also, quite frankly, China. I don't think that all of these disciplines make sense if you do not get into the world's largest subsidizer. So if you want to think about critical mass on subsidies, you absolutely need to have China there. But I mean, reversal of burden of proof, for it to have a meaning, you need to change the rules. You need to change some concepts which have a relevance for WTO dispute settlement. So this would be one of the issues that would have to be negotiated with China. I mean, what I think you might be able to do even before you have negotiated the new rules is this agreement on transparency, this commitment to notify more subsidies, so there's a better knowledge about what's going on. But if you want to avoid legal consequences from the failure to notify, then you need to be able to adjust the rules of the ASCM. So that's a rules negotiation. No, what you have said, Chad, it is quite true. And it's a little bit difficult to see what the best solution is. I mean, to a certain extent, if you were going to imagine a situation in which we have agreed to negotiate on the subsidies, in which we have agreed that certain of the rules on TDI need to be tackled by the membership. We cannot just simply leave this for adjudication. The membership has to clarify some of those areas in which the Appellate Body has taken very controversial decisions, or where the rules are not very clear, and we know there's big issues underlying the lack of clarity. So if you were going to agree that those are issues that have to be put into a negotiating track, to what extent you can combine that with two concepts? One concept is some degree of self-restraint in how much you apply the rules while this negotiation is being undertaken. Obviously, there's not going to be any question of giving up the right to take those actions, but some degree of self-restraint. And then also the question about to what extent, if members have agreed that certain issues need to be clarified because the rules are not clear, to what extent those are issues in which there should be some kind of agreement not to litigate about those in the WTO. So if you were going to imagine that over the next 4 years, we would be negotiating on subsidies, we would be negotiating on some specific areas of the anti-dumping agreement, some specific areas of the safeguards agreement, you could at least conceptually imagine to combine this with this concept of self-restraint, not something that you give up the right, but at least that you are aware that if everyone over-exercises that right, everyone is going to be negatively affected, because as you have quite rightly said, we have all become kind of non-market these days.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is the moment where we open it up to our general public. Please let me invite you again to put your questions in the chat if you like, but I think it would still be nice if you could ask your questions actually on the screen, so we see you and we know who you are, and we have the impression of this being actually more of a face-to-face meeting. So we have a first question from Elisa Baroncini. If you'd like to ask your question, please, the floor is yours.
Shall I speak to tell?
Please. Yes.
Okay, it's for Professor Bersero, and it's about the MPIA, the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement. Now, it is very recently reported in the press that the US ambassador wrote a letter to the WTO Director General where the United States opposed the establishment of a division within the WTO Secretariat and of devoting specifically WTO staff for the functioning of the MPIA. And also the United States opposes the funding, the financement of this interim arrangement with the regular budget of the WTO. Now, I wonder whether you see a way out of this in order to overcome these last obstacle, maybe on the setting up of the MPIA. So what is your view about this? Thank you so much.
Well, I have to confess that one of the advantages of being in Oxford and reflecting about the future, I have focused myself much more on what I think is the fundamental question, which is how to bring the United States back on board into the acceptance of binding two-step dispute settlement. And that's what I analyzed in my paper. I put a number of ideas, which I hope the United States will be ready to discuss, and it will be ready to come to try to find a way forward to solve the fundamental issue, which is how to restore a binding dispute settlement mechanism that applies to all. Now, on the multi-party arbitration agreement, I think it was a critical initiative that was taken by a number of countries to try to be sure that at least among those countries, the system is maintained. So I think it's very important that it continues to go ahead. I find it a little bit difficult to understand the arguments of Ambassador Shea because the legal basis under the DSU for the multi-party interim arbitration is Article 25 DSU. And arbitrations under Article 25 have always been supported by the WTO Secretariat. The thing is how to ensure that there is the proper mechanism of support which maintains the distinction between the role of the legal service of the WTO to advise panels and those who advise the arbitrator. So I'm not very clear about what is the justification for what the United States has said in Geneva. But I think this is an issue basically for my colleagues in DigiTrade who are dealing with these issues. I have been looking much more beyond the immediate into, but I still hope sooner or later should be the way forward, which is that we sit together with the United States to see how to solve the crisis of dispute settlement. I think the United States has raised a number of concerns which I think are legitimate. I have, if you read my paper, you will see that on a number of points which have been made by the United States, I think that the United States has a point. Unfortunately, the United States up to now has not really decided to engage in Geneva. I hope that will change rather sooner than later.
Thank you very much. The next question is by Mark Linsgård. So if you'd like to ask your question, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for this event. IGNACIO and I go back to Uruguay round where we were apprentice negotiators on safeguards, respectively for EC and United States. So my first question is on plurilaterals. You know, I'm a huge believer since Bali, and I wonder if IGNACIO or others have a concept of critical mass in rules areas. It's pretty straightforward in a tariff negotiation. We've got, you know, the ITA, there's a concept of it with environmental goods negotiations, but in rules it's a little more complicated. And, you know, who needs to be in for a plurilateral in rules, for example, on subsidies to go forward? And then secondly, on agriculture, and my question is whether there's a view that there are elements of agriculture that could be negotiated plurilaterally, or whether instead it has to be done multilaterally. Is agriculture self-balancing, or does it require trade-offs from other areas if it's done multilaterally, which gets us back into the whole of the Doha round, which, you know, I don't think could ever be viable again.
Well, Mark, it's great to hear you. It's been, as you say, we go a long way. Well, I am totally convinced that finding the way forward on the plurilaterals on rules is the critical issue to revitalize the negotiating function in the WTO. If you are thinking about market access, yes, there is a way forward. You inscribe commitments in the schedule, and then you need to identify the critical mass, and that works more or less. Sometimes it's challenging, but that works. But it's not really a very appropriate approach to deal with rules issues. I mean, there's of course the whole history of what happened on trade facilitation, or at the end of the day, it was concluded as a multilateral agreement. Now, I am personally convinced that one of the problems of the design of the WTO is this requirement that in order to add an agreement to Annex 4, you need to have consensus, and as a result of that, no new agreement has been added to Annex 4. One of the ideas which I tried to develop in my paper is try to identify some criteria that would be broadly acceptable to get agreements added into Annex 4. And that would imply some guarantees about inclusiveness and transparency of the negotiating process. It would also imply some guarantee that, of course, you cannot use a plurilateral agreement to derogate from the rights that countries already have under the WTO. But at the same time, insofar as the plurilateral agreement adds elements which go beyond WTO rules, those can only be enforced as among those countries that participate in the plurilateral agreement. Now, those are the concepts which I put forward in my paper. I mean, I have been thinking of those, for instance, in relation to a subsidies agreement on industrial products. I will come to agriculture later, but on industrial products, clearly you cannot have an agreement without China. You would need to have OECD countries, China. Hopefully you will get some more emerging economies, but how many is always going to be difficult. But I'm sure there will be a problem if we agree, for instance, of new prohibitions of certain types of subsidies. And then a country who has not joined this agreement can simply bring a dispute settlement case against the participant and say, well, I have not accepted those disciplines, but you have, and therefore the subsidy that you have given is a prohibited one. That, in my view, would not work. So that's a concept which I know is going to be complicated, which is challenging, but which, in my view, would provide a way forward to make it more easy to negotiate plurilateral agreements in the WTO on rules. Of course, you will need to give guarantees of transparency, of inclusiveness. It cannot just simply be a number of countries sitting somewhere and saying, we want to include this agreement now into Annex 4. Now, agriculture, I am being cautious. I haven't really talked a lot about agriculture in my paper, but it seems to me obvious that you would need to tackle agriculture subsidies, domestic support within this framework of negotiations. I think you should probably try to tackle it multilaterally. I think it would be complicated to tackle it as a pure plurilateral agreement. So I suspect that domestic support on agriculture would somehow have to be part of this 4-year program of WTO reform.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question by Jan van Helf. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for your paper, Ignacio, and definitely a timely contribution. But what I'm wondering, and for also the panelists, we have talked a lot about strategic sectors and in the context of subsidies and what we aim for. Before COVID, we had the discussion about the national security exception. How far does it reach? I think we haven't come really to a conclusion what this concerns, and aren't we running into the same problems once we look at subsidies, and how do we define all of this, and how can we put, I think, and what seems to me somehow the same coin, the two sides of the same coin, these questions on national security, sovereignty, also essential supply chains, all boil down to this question of how far are we willing to assert national sovereignty to the multilateral stage, and do you think really make progress, and how would you go forward? Thanks.
Well, I don't know where I should be the only one responding, because I think this may also go to Chad. I think Chad would probably want. Do you want to go ahead, Chad, and then I start? Okay. Well, I mean, the first point about subsidies is that subsidies are already covered by the WTO. All types of subsidies, provided that they cause injury or serious prejudice, can give rise to either countervailing duties or to a case in WTO dispute settlement, which is not very effective because the disciplines on multilateral on subsidies, they are quite difficult to trigger. But of course, countervailing duties are much easier. And I suppose that the reason why Chad was saying about the risk of this proliferation of trade defense measures is because since subsidies are going to become much more frequently used, you are going to see also a proliferation of countervailing duties that may become the favored instrument of trade defense, which is why I think that you need to find a way to negotiate about those. Now, I'm not sure that in that negotiation the national security element necessarily needs to feature. I mean, if you look into the Uruguay-Bound agreement, there were basically 3 types of subsidies that were recognized as being legitimate and that therefore under certain conditions should be green listed. That was environmental subsidies, research and development subsidies, and regional subsidies. So at least I would assume that these are going to be the 3 categories of subsidies that if you want to negotiate better rules, you would need to see, okay, these type of subsidies, under what conditions should be excluded from a serious prejudice case or for the application of countervailing duties. There may be others, but I'm not sure that we would need to define a national security subsidy. At least that's my initial thought. Now, of course, the issue of national security is still there. Of course, I would hope that the US comes to the view that it's not a very wise attitude to continue using 232 to protect economic sectors. That's something that hopefully is not going to continue to be the policy of the United States. Now, if it continues to be the policy, I have some ideas in my paper about how to try to handle that in a better manner than through dispute settlement. But anyway, I think the more fundamental issue is that certain instruments are inevitably going to be used for security reasons, investment screening, export controls. Tariffs is not a good instrument to fulfill the national security objectives, and it should not be used for that purpose.
All right. Well, Chad, you look like you wanted to make a comment, and please do. After that, I'll also give Elvia the opportunity to come back to this or to anything else that's been said in the discussion. So, Chad, if you want to comment on something else as well, please feel free to do so. And to all participants, if there are more questions you'd like to ask, please do that in the chat function, and then I'll get to you afterwards.
So I did want to address the strategic sectors question, and I don't have, I'm going to say up front, I don't have the answer to this either. But I think this is a problem, and this is a challenge, and this is something that we're going to have to grapple with that we've never had to grapple with before. The 232, we haven't had to grapple with it yet in the WTO because we haven't seen the panel decisions or if there were an appellate body, what the reactions to that would be. If the Trump administration gets reelected and we get panel decisions on the 232s, politically, this is going to be a nightmare for the WTO. Even if it's not, and we come up with some political way of resolving that problem, there is, I think, just even on the tariff side, their actions, the Trump administration's actions have opened up this question about we need to have a bit more clarity about what legitimate use of Article 21 as a defense, kind of would be, because it puts the WTO, it puts too much political pressure on the WTO, as we've seen from this. So it sort of has to be dealt with just on that side. But quite separately, on the issue of export controls and subsidies, I don't think it's going to be as easy as us just saying we don't need to think about this within the WTO anymore, we're just entering into a fundamentally different world. I don't think US-China is ever going to go back. I think this is going to be a new, state of the world for a while. So let me connect some of the dots for what we're seeing in semiconductors and that proposal in the United States and why this is relevant. So the export control expansion in the United States for semiconductors to semiconductor manufacturing equipment has basically told the American semiconductor industry, effectively, you're no longer going to have access to the Chinese market for sales. And so their response has been, we're massively reliant on sales, on exports to the Chinese market and to firms that also supply the Chinese market, because they're a big source of our revenue. That source of our revenue, global revenue, is what allows us to do the R&D necessary to be able to be at the forefront of this industry. So if you're going to cut that off from us, that's why we need subsidies. And so now in the United States, in Congress, there are these proposals to give it's sort of the quid pro quo. It's saying, we're going to cut you off from the Chinese market, and in exchange for that, we're going to make up, through industrial policy, through subsidies, the loss of revenues that you're facing by the export control restrictions. So these things are connected in ways that we're going to have to think through in multilateral disciplines. Obviously, there's going to be, increasing, you can imagine, we've got the dispute ongoing between Japan and South Korea, but you can imagine even sort of in a cooperative world between the United States and China, the desire to challenge some of those things. Anyway, this is all, I don't have answers to these questions, but the answer to them isn't, we don't have to think about them. Unfortunately, we are going to have to think about them if we're going to want to make sure that we have a robust, resilient, especially dispute settlement function of the WTO to deal with the forthcoming pressures on these issues of national security.
Elvira, is there anything you'd like to add to this point or another point in the discussion we've had so far?
No, I think take more question for Ignacio. It's more interesting. We have a little time left.
All right, good. So I think the next question is by Henry Gao. So please, Henry, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm using my desktop, so no video this time, but I guess some people can recognize my voice, especially Chad, who is sitting very quiet there. So my question is basically, is it possible to have, what Ignacio has put really nicely, to have a so-called competitive cooperative relationship with China? Because China does not take even the slightest offense very lightly. Actually, it has this kind of victimhood mentality, Whenever some country says something, criticize China for no matter what, they are going to take it very badly and they are going to react very violently. So if you want to have a competitive relationship, I would take it that invariably you would want to criticize China, certain things China did from time to time, and then China would react very violently. Then how would you continue cooperating with China?
Well, I think that that's a very deep question, Henry. I think that in any case, we in Europe, and I'm sure the United States, would need to have our own strategic autonomy when it comes to relations with China. And if there are certain aspects of its policy that we disagree, we should not hesitate in criticizing them. In the same way that I assume that China may want to criticize aspects of our policies on which we do not agree. Now, I don't think that however, means that we should be in a confrontation dynamic with China, because China is a key stakeholder in the WTO. I am convinced there cannot be a function in the WTO without China. And it should also be in China's interest to try to make sure that its relationship with Europe, its relationship with the United States, is done on the basis of commonly agreed rules, and that China is involved in drafting those rules. I have always been a little bit skeptical about this strategy of the Obama administration. We do the rules without China, and then China will come later on, knocking the door and ask to join the rules that we have negotiated without them. So I think we need to accept that if we wanted to negotiate about disciplines on subsidies, if we want to look into further clarification of the rules on remedies, China needs to be there. China needs to be sitting on the negotiating table. Now, would China be ready to do so? Who knows? Quite frankly, one thing that we don't really know, would China have been ready to go beyond what it did in the phase one agreement with the United States, which quite frankly, from the point of view of institutional reform, was very, very limited. If instead of being a bilateral negotiation with the United States, it had been a broader plurilateral negotiation based on rules rather than based on managed trade, which was the approach of the United States. That's something which still needs to be tested. Of course, it might be that United States, together with a number of countries, comes to China and say, we would want you to join in negotiating certain issues in the WTO, and China says, no, we are very happy with the status quo. That's a possibility. I also talk a little bit about that at the end of my paper in terms of what we should be doing in those circumstances. But I still think that at least it is worth testing the willingness of China to negotiate improvements of the rules of the WTO. They will also have their own proposals. Everything, if you have a multilateral negotiation, you need to be able to engage with the proposals of both sides. But I think that at least that's something that needs to be tested. And the more cooperative that China is, the more that our relationship can be in the cooperation angle rather than in the competition angle. But I think it's clear, and I take very well the point of Chad, that it's difficult to totally ignore things like export controls. But I fear that on certain issues, it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult to try to agree in the WTO about rules that would be applicable. But anyway, that's something I think we need to do more thinking about that.
Good. So we have a little less than 10 minutes left. So I think we'll have one more question, and there is one by Ronald Steenblick, and then I'll give the panelists the opportunity to wrap up. Ronald Steenblick, please, the floor is yours.
Well, hello. It wasn't really a question. It was just more an observation on the question of the assumption that, obviously, the kind of subsidies that would be basically made non-actionable or whatever. Thinking of the expired Article 8 would be environmental. And I've heard this so much, but people really need to be very, very explicit about what exactly they mean. In the original Article 8, it was just, I think it was 25% subsidy or 20% subsidy to existing facilities to help them pay for the cost of meeting new environmental regulations. That's pretty restricting. And in fact, nobody even availed themselves to it, which meant that they had to inform the WTO beforehand that they were planning to do this. You know, what one hears is calls for basically allowing, providing a safe harbor for environmental subsidies broadly or for renewable energy. But then again, what kind? If they're for deployment, those in a sense from a WTO mercantilistic viewpoint, they're trade facilitating. But if they're for production, then you know it's the same old problem as we have for any other production subsidies. So I'm not sure it's helpful to just say, oh, environmental subsidies, because that covers a very, very broad area. And then finally, as I pointed out in my comments, that if one were to make it, I mean, even circumscribed around renewable energy, there are a whole lot of inputs like inverters, like all kinds of electrical equipment that have dual use. And so, you know, if you're trying to circumscribe this narrowly, you would run into the same definitional boundaries and dual use issues as has confounded the negotiations on eliminating tariffs on environmental goods. The big difference is that nobody's hurt by eliminating tariffs on environmental goods, but you do have adverse effects on other countries if you're subsidizing, you get into a subsidy war over environmental products.
Ignacio, you want to react to that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's a totally valid comment. In my view, there are two things. I mean, it's clear that it cannot just simply be going back to Article 8 of the ASCM and say this now becomes again applicable. you would need, and it cannot be either to say you just label the subsidy as being environmental, you give it for an environmental purpose, and therefore automatically this is exempted from WTO dispute settlement, this is exempted from countervailing duties. You would need to identify some criteria that the subsidy needs to comply with in order to fall under the green box. If you don't comply that criteria, that doesn't mean that the subsidy is prohibited, but you may be subject to potential countervailing duties. You may be subject to potentially a WTO dispute settlement case. So in a way, you need to define a safe harbor, and you need to define it with criteria which are relevant for the type of environmental challenges which are being faced today. Now, that work needs to be done. It's a work which has not yet been done. I think that there have been a number of papers that talk about the issue. I referred a bit to those in my paper, but I think that this is something on which there will have to be much more thinking. And honestly, it's not an issue that we really tackled with the United States and Japan when we were discussing the trilateral. Then it was much more focused on the red and the amber, but we said nothing about the green. But in my view, it's very difficult to imagine that you have a negotiation in the WTO and you don't look into the three categories of subsidies. But I agree that it's not just as simple as saying my purpose is protecting the environment, therefore I fall under the green box.
All right, so we are reaching the end of this very interesting webinar, and I think what I would like to do is to invite Chad.Bown and Elvia Fabry first to share some final thoughts with us, and then we'll come to you, Ignacio. Elvia, would you like to start?
Well, I tended to go to the very short term and the political conditions for any engagement in WTO reform. And when I read, like many of you, the article of Lighthizer in Foreign Affairs, I think what was striking is that WTO reform was, of course, mentioned, but the need to reform was mentioned, but really reduced to the discussion about the dispute settlement mechanism. And so we see there's a very exclusive focus, which is quite frustrating. And in addition, there was you have the impression that it's of course a paper which is intended to pave the way for the campaign on the trade side, but which is completely limited to a face-to-face between China and the US, and where other partners are completely missing, Europeans, but as well as Canadian, Japanese, and we see that it's going to be more than ever key to have a more inclusive approach, and with trade partners stepping into the discussion about WTO reform and really putting the agenda on the front. And I think, Christian, that we have understand very well today that it won't be a one-shot webinar, that you need to launch a series of webinars around all the proposal of IGNACIO, because the menu is quite extensive.
Point taken. Chad.
So agree with Elvira, the Lighthizer piece in Foreign Affairs, it's worth reading and makes your hair blow off. What I wanted to end on is to think back to the 1980s when we were thinking about similar issues on subsidies in the agricultural world. One of the big things that we had to do back at that time, when there were so many problems, was we had to figure out what we were even talking about. And what we did back then is we tasked the OECD with coming up with ways and frameworks to estimate where the subsidies mattered, where they were important, where they were really harming trade, creating these wedges so that we could prioritize. We're going to need to start to do that today. You're going to need, Ignacio, as you get back to Brussels, get this agenda out there, you're going to need to task the economists of the world with putting numbers on these things to help us prioritize. We're not going to be able to do all of them. We're going to need to have numbers on which ones are the most important economically and are the ones that we need to be worried about the most. And it's going to be much more complicated than the 1980s, but a similar type of approach, I think, is needed to help provide a little bit of clarity for the path forward. So don't forget the economists, is my parting word.
Thank you very much. Ignacio, before we come to you, just on that last point on the transparency and the analogies between agriculture and agricultural subsidies and industrial subsidies today, we have a very interesting paper by Bob Wolf, which I would like to recommend, and which you can find under the link where our general publications on WTO reform are found, which is at the top of the chat. But now to you, Ignacio.
Well, listen, it has been a really fascinating webinar, and a pity we didn't have more time because there was, I'm sure, quite a lot of great questions to discuss. One comment and one reaction to what Chad just said. One dimension which I think is important that we don't forget when we are talking about WTO reform is that the vast majority of members of the WTO are vulnerable developing countries in Africa, but not only in Africa. And therefore, I think if you wanted to get this agenda moving forward in the WTO, you would also need to be able to see things a little bit more from their perspective and to try to identify how this agenda can be of relevance for them at the moment, which I think is going to be quite important. On the one hand, you have all this dynamic in Africa to regional economic integration, the African continental free trade area, but also African countries, at least many of them, are likely to be in a rather exposed position in the post-COVID-19 world. So I think how this issue is linked into the WTO reform agenda continues to be, from my point of view, one of the critical questions. On the point that has been made by Chad about economies, now, I agree. I think that clearly we need to do much deeper analysis. What we have been doing in the trilateral is good conceptually. It is more work of lawyers than work of economists. But maybe this idea of beer, why don't we start initially with transparency, and as part of this transparency exercise, we also improve our analytical basis to understand what are the type of subsidies which are out there, which are the type of subsidies which are more problematic. This is something which I think could help. It should not detract from the need to put this in a negotiating perspective, but maybe in all negotiations you always have a first more analytical phase before you actually get down to a change textual proposal. So I take this point back, and I will see where I can convince my colleagues from Brussels that it is worth investing on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you, in particular to our panelists, Elvia Fabry, Chad.Bown, and Ignacio Bercero, for this very insightful webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot. So that was really good. Also, many thanks to our participants who have enriched this webinar with their good comments and questions. So thank you very much for this as well. The Global Economic Dynamics project of the Bertelsmann Stiftung is going to continue to work on WTO reform. And I think your suggestion, Elvia, that we do more webinars and that we maybe break this down into individual issues and that we follow up about what's happening over time is a very good one. And I'll take you up on that, absolutely. So a recording of this webinar is going to appear on the website of the Global Economic Dynamics project in a couple of days. So that's bed-project.de, and it'll also appear on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to forward that recording to anyone who couldn't be here today, you're more than welcome to do so. And with that, thank you very much for being here today, and I wish you a lovely weekend. Take good care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.